Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, before I start reading my paper, I'll request you kindly to make corrections in your copies according as I read the paper, because there are some mistakes left in the Sato style copy. Tradition is as important in the music as it is in the culture of a people. In fact, our music has developed through the past ages to its present form on the basis of tradition, vocal or oral instruction from generation to generation. The history itself of the music has to be traced through the traditional beliefs and usages. The very practical forms of the ragas and musical compositions in them were, till 50 years ago, kept up in the oral traditions. They were not recorded on paper, there having been no notation system in vogue. The ancient Vedic chants, the gathas and gitis, the musical renderings of which were treated later on independently from their wordings under a class of songs called jatis, and the ragas, which now form the basic idea of all Indian music, have all been handed down to us by tradition. All art in its ultimate and highest level is individual self-expression. After passing through all the discipline of ear and voice training, the traditional systems of the ragas and talas, which are just the medium of expressing oneself, a student of music, if he has the true artist in him, evolves fresh forms of musical expression which in themselves set a new tradition. But apart from individual self-expression, there is regional self-expression and national self-expression. Regional art, national art, and it is in these that tradition always plays an important part. Music, after all, is relative. What is music to an Indian may strike a non-Indian as noise, and vice versa. Hence, we have so many systems of music: Indian music, Western music, Chinese music, Persian music, African music, etc. In India itself, we have two distinct systems of music, the Hindustani and the Dakshinatya. Among the orthodox musicians and their equally orthodox listeners on either side, we find persons vehemently scoffing at the other system. But in spite of all the scoffings and screamings against it, it is music for a colossal number of listeners. It is the effect of tradition that music is regional or national. Through age-long traditional usages, music takes a distinct form, a distinct characteristic, which makes it Hindustani, Carnataki, Bengali, Maharashtri, or Punjabi in its regional aspects, or on the other hand, classical music, folk music, temple music, chamber music, stage music, and so on in the cultural aspect. The most important and characteristic tradition of Indian music is its melodic form, as distinguished from music which is based on harmony. Indian musical expression is by succession of tones and not by simultaneous sounding of several tones together. The term varna, occurring in the very definition of a raga, as given by Matanga, points to the melodic form of our music. Musical values created by a variety of musical patterns, melodic patterns, each on its part expressed in various different ways with vocal modulations, rhythmic settings, and graces of music known as gamakas, weak and strong accents on the notes of a scale, have enriched Indian music. In fact, the musical rendering of a raga is like an act on the stage. The notes of the scale acting each its appointed role and behaving towards the other notes according to a given plan, so that the whole play impresses the audience as it were they were being regaled with colorful representation of a dreamland story or a fairy tale. The next traditional habit strongly embedded in the mind of the Indian music listener is his unswerving attention to the tonic. He understands and appreciates the mode, each and every form, every tone in the melody, its correct or incorrect intonation and expression in relation to the shadja, which is always the tonic for all music. Whatever flights and flourishes of musical passages the musician may show off in the course of his interpretation of the raga, he must come back to the tonic and keep the modal character of the melody ever fresh in the minds of the listeners. The tonic is, of course, fixed by the musician himself according to the range of his voice or musical instrument he plays on. It is not a standard pitch. When once the tonic is fixed at a certain convenient degree of pitch by the musician, all his performance will be based on this tonic. He may raise or lower the pitch according to the needs of a fresh melody he wishes to take up if he feels it necessary. But once a shadja, tonic, is fixed for a certain melody, the melody will always be understood on the basis of in relation to the tonic fixed for it. It is the tonic which gives the melody its peculiar character. Let me demonstrate the point. Let us suppose that we are listening to a demonstration in the raga Jayajayanti. But it will sound Jayajayanti all right, so long as our attention is fixed on the shadja, the tonic. If, however, a clever musician puts the tonic in the background and emphasizes rishabha too much, he creates an atmosphere of bhairavi for a little while, and then all of a sudden returns to the tonic, which as soon as it is introduced turns all the effect of the bhairavi into that of Jayajayanti. I will illustrate just now. Now, so long as the attention of the audience is diverted to the re as the basic in the voice of the musician, it will sound bhairavi. But as soon as he returns to the sa, the whole thing becomes Jayajayanti. This is the importance of the tonic. Then other examples of this is a musical jugglery. Other examples of this similar jugglery are bhairavi and yaman. I'm singing bhairavi. Sa re ga ma pa ma ga re, sa re ga ma pa ma ga re ga ma pa da pa ma ga re, sa re ga ma pa ma ga re sa. Now re, Komal re is being made, for a time as sa. Re ra ra na 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 ra 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 na no no re ra na 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 no. Re na 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 ra na 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 re ra ra no re ra ra na 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 no na no. As soon as I return to sa, the whole thing becomes bhairavi. Then other example So you can hear the Sarangin Todi. Sa re ga ma re ni za ni ra ma ga re, re ga ma ra na 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 na, re sa re ma pa ma re ga pa re ga ma da ma ga da ma ga re, sa re ma pa ma re sa, re ga ma da ma ga re sa. This is Todi. Re ga ma da ma ga re sa, sa re ma pa ma re sa ni. Then Bihag also. Sa ga ma ga ni pa ga ma pa ni sa ni pa re ga ma ga, di re re na 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 no, re 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 na 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 no, re di re na no, re na na no. When I return to the sa, it becomes Bihag again. Re re na na sa re ga pa da ni da pa ga sa re sa. Ga ma pa ni sa re sa ni pa ga ma ga sa. Another idea which has been traditionally uppermost in the mind of the Indian listener of music is the predominance of vocal music. Vadyam Geetanugam, say our Shastrakaras. The definition of raga also appears to hint at this. Here again, the restriction of musical movements to the four varnas, namely the repetition of a single tone, ascent from a lower to a higher tone, descent from a higher to a lower tone, and the combination of all these three movements, which are the only possible movements for the human voice, unless, of course, it is hoarse, hints at the Shastrakaras had the human voice and its natural limits in their minds when they wrote this definition of the raga. It is true that instrumental music has its own elaborate technique. In fact, each instrument has its own technique dependent on its size, shape and make, and our Shastrakaras have elaborately described the karanas or hasta vyaparas, the strokes and fingering on the keyboards of all the types of musical instruments that have been in vogue in Indian music. String instruments played by the plectrum lack the continuity, the unbroken flow of a single musical tone of a musical passage, and have therefore developed a technique independent of and different from vocal music, which is more or less influenced by rhythmic treatment, the strings having to be struck by the plectrum over and over again. String instruments played by the bow as well as wind instruments can very well express long notes and as such follow vocal music. The technique of a musical instrument has after all reference only to the way in which it is to be manipulated. The music, of course, to be played on it is the same as vocal music. The limits, however, of the instrument and consequently its special technique give the music a certain shape which is quite independent. String instruments like the veena and satar, of course, veena, I mean North Indian bean, are not played in accompaniment to classical music in North India. In the Dakshinatya Sangeet, however, the veena is played even today in accompaniment to voice. In fact, violin is now the foremost instrument. In fact, the violin, which is now the most foremost instrument of accompaniment to vocal music in the Dakshinatya system, was introduced only about 100 years ago. Before that, the veena alone seems to have been played in accompaniment to the vocal music. In the north too, in the past, the sarangi was supposed to be fit to be played only with the light type of songs, such as Tumri and ghazals. High-browed classical vocalists never allowed it to be played with them. We are told that Mia Tansen used to have a veena player accompanying him, probably Samokhan Singh or Mr. Singh. The descendants of this great musician, however, seem to have given up vocal music and taken to playing on string instruments, namely the veena and the rabab. They have no doubt developed a highly specialized type of music on these instruments, which has enabled those instruments to be played in independent solos for hours together, keeping the audience spellbound, as it were, throughout the program. But let me draw the attention of the music listener of today to the modern tendency among instrumental musicians of today to imitate vocal expression, even on instruments played by the plectrum, to show us, as it were, that vocal music does, after all, lead all musical expression in India. The technique as such of the veena, sitar, sarod, etc., as pointed out a few minutes ago, is influenced by rhythmic treatment. No doubt, they have opened a line of musical entertainment in the elaborate and complicated drumming on the tabla or pakhav. The art of tabla playing came out in all its glory when it is comes out in all its glory when it is played in accompaniment to string instruments of the veena type. In fact, some sitar players play on their instruments in a style which gives the impression of tabla balls set to music on the sitar. It will not be wrong to say that in the quick tempo, sitar and sarod surpass vocal music. The jhala is a speciality of string instrument plucked by the plectrum. It is a part of the climax or the close-up of the extempore elaboration and improvisation of a raga. The tala system is again an ancient tradition peculiar to Indian music. Out of the long and short durations of the syllables of the Vedic mantras, two elaborate systems of time measurement were evolved, namely the system of syllabic meters, ganam vritta, and the other, the system of musical meters or matra vritta. The ganam vritta was employed in poetic verses, while matra vrittas were used for a type of verse known as giti, meant to be sung. Out of the matra vritta, an elaborate system of musical time or tala was evolved, which is still prevalent in Indian music, though in a modified form. The Shuladi Sapta talas, all played on the mridangam in the South Indian system of music, and talas of the Drupad style played on the pakhav, talas of khayal and thumri styles played on the tabla in the Hindustani music, are the comparatively modern forms of the ancient tala system. An Indian musician never attacks a musical tone directly. There is always a leading note, mostly a lower one attached to the main tone. For example, when we have to sing sa, we never say sa, pa, ga, sa. But we say sa, pa, sa, as if we are drawing out the note from somewhere. Pa, ga, dha, ma, re, dha, ma, re, sa, pa. We don't sing like that. To an Indian musician, singing is like swimming in water. All movements, whether of the voice or the string, are wavy. This is why keyboard instruments such as the harmonium, piano are considered unfit for correct expression of Indian music. I am reminded here of the old famous saying of our Shastrakaras, Yathap sucharata margo meenanam nopalabhyate akasheva vihanganam tadvat sarvatasati. It is not possible, say they, that to trace the path of the fish in water, nor that of the birds flying in the sky. Even so, is it impossible to trace the Shrutis in the movements of the swaras. This shloka occurs in a different context, it is true, but the idea behind it is the same. There is very little, if at all, of detached swaras. Let me demonstrate how the swaras of a raga, if sung detached, spoil the effect thereof. I'll sing Bhairavi with the detached note. Sa re da ni pa ma pa da ni re sa ni sa re ga ma re sa ni sa re ma re sa ni sa re sa da ni pa ma pa da ni re sa. This is not Indian music, not Darbari. Da da ni re re sa re re sa ni sa re da ni ba ma pa ra ra ni re sa da ni sa re 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 ga re sa re da ni sa ma re sa ni sa re da ni ba. Not re da ni pa ma pa ra ni re sa re ga ma re sa. This is how detached notes are sung. The musical compositions, the Drupad, Horis, Khayals, Thumris, Tappas, Taranas in classical music and Rasiyas, Goat, Baul, Bhatiyal, Launi, Garba and hundreds of devotional songs sung by our saint poets of the Bhakti age present to us a rich and endless treasure of the traditional knowledge and practice of our music. In fact, the whole theory of our music has been built up in conformity and on the basis of these traditional musical compositions handed down to us through the mouth-to-mouth training carried on in the families of professional musicians. Authenticity of a raga form and of the style of its practical rendering had been preserved in these traditional compositions, and as such they were highly prized and jealously guarded as a treasure by the musicians of old.